this as late in the game as possible. For all the scant help the Great White Father had given him, he could wait. Tough did he. Then he remembered that Marconi lived way the hell out and gone on the other side of new plots, and that there wasn't enough gas in the brat to even get halfway across town, let alone back. But it was 2:03. He had less than an hour of computer time left. He would worry about the damn dissection later. Caroon constructed a makeshift chute leading to the entrance of Portal 1. Really the first Jaunt slide, Mark told the children, and Patty found the idea of a Jaunt slide for mice deliciously funny, and dropped a fresh white mouse into it. He blocked the end with a large book, and after a few moments of aimless pattering and sniffing, the mouse went through the portal and disappeared. Caroon ran back across the barn. The mouse was DOA. There was no blood and no bodily swellings to indicate that a radical change in pressure had ruptured something inside. Caroon supposed that oxygen starvation might. He shook his head impatiently. It took the white mouse only nanoseconds to go through. His own watch had confirmed that time remained a constant in the process, or damn close to it. The second white mouse joined the first in the paper sack. Caroon got a third out, a fourth if you counted the fortunate mouse that escaped through the crack, wondering for the first time which would end first, his computer time or his supply of mice. He held this one firmly around the body and forced its haunches through the portal. Across the room, he saw the haunches reappear. Just the haunches. The disembodied little feet were dragging frantically through the rough wood of the crate. Caroon pulled the mouse back. No catatonia here. It bit the webbing between his thumb and forefinger hard enough to bring blood. Caroon dropped the mouse hurriedly back into the I Came From Stackpole's House of Pets box and used a small bottle of hydrogen peroxide in his lab first aid kit to disinfect the bite. He put a Band-Aid over it, then rummaged around until he found a pair of heavy work gloves. He could feel the time running out. It was 2:11 now. He got another mouse out and pushed it through backward, all the way. He hurried across to Portal 2. This mouse lived for almost 2 minutes. It even walked a little, after a fashion. He staggered across the Pomoma orange crate, fell on its side, struggled weakly to its feet, and then only squatted there. Caroon snapped his fingers near its head, and it lurched perhaps 4 steps further before falling on its side again. The aspiration of its size slowed, stopped. It was dead. Caroon felt a chill. He went back and got another mouse and pushed it halfway through head first. He saw it reappear at the other end, just the head, then the neck, then chest. Cautiously, Caroon relaxed his grip on the mouse's body, ready to grab it if it got frisky. It didn't. The mouse only stood there, half on one side of the barn, half on the other. Caroon jogged back to Portal 2. The mouse was alive, but its pink eyes were glazed and dull. Its whiskers didn't move. Going around to the back of the portal, Caroon saw an amazing sight. As he had seen the pencil in Cutaway, so now he saw the mouse. He saw the vertebrae of its tiny spine ending abruptly in round, white circles. He saw its blood moving through the vessels. He saw the tissue moving gently with the tide of life around its minuscule gullet. If nothing else, he thought, and wrote later in his Popular Mechanics article, it would make a wonderful diagnostic tool. Then he noticed that the tidal movement of the tissues had ceased. The mouse had died. Caroon pulled the mouse out by the snout, not liking the feel of it, and dropped it into the paper sack with its companions. Enough with the white mice, he decided. The mice die. They die if you put them through all the way, and they die if you put them through halfway head first. Put them through halfway butt first. They stay frisky. What the hell is in there? Sensory input, he thought almost randomly. When they go through, they see something, hear something, touch something, God, maybe even smell something that literally kills them. What? He had no idea, but he meant to find out. Caroon still had almost 40 minutes from Link pulled the database out from under him. He unscrewed the thermometer from the wall beside the kitchen door, trotted back to the barn with it, and put it through the portals. The thermometer went in at 83 degrees Fahrenheit. It came out at 83 degrees Fahrenheit. He rummaged through the spare room where he kept a few toys to amuse his grandchildren with. Among them he found a packet of balloons. He blew one of them up, tied it off, and batted it through the portal. It came out intact and unharmed. A start down the road toward answering his question about a sudden change in pressure somehow caused by what he was already thinking of as the jaunting process. With 5 minutes to go before the witching hour, he ran into his house, snatched up his goldfish bowl. Inside, Percy and Patrick swished their tails and darted about in agitation, and ran back with it. He shoved the goldfish bowl through Portal 1. He hurried across to Portal 2, where his goldfish bowl sat on the crate. Patrick was floating belly up. Percy swam slowly near the bottom of the bowl, as if dazed. A moment later, he also floated belly up. Caroon was reaching for the goldfish bowl when Percy gave a weak flick of his tail and resumed his lackadaisical swimming. Slowly, he seemed to throw off whatever the effect had been, and by the time Caroon got back to Moscone's veterinary clinic that night at 9 o'clock, Percy seemed as perky as ever. Patrick was dead. Caroon fed Percy a double ration of fish food and gave Patrick a hero's burial in the garden. After the computer had cut him off, out for the day, Caroon decided to hitch a ride over to Moscone's. Accordingly, he was standing on the shoulder of Route 26 at 3:45 that afternoon, dressed in jeans and a loud plaid sport coat, his thumb out, a paper bag in his other hand. Finally, a kid driving a Corvette, not much bigger than a sardine can, pulled over, and Caroon got in. "What you got in the bag, my man?" "Bunch of dead mice," Caroon said. Eventually another car stopped. When the farmer behind the wheel asked about the bag, Caroon told him it was a couple of sandwiches. Moscone dissected one of the mice on the spot and agreed to dissect the others later and called Caroon on the telephone with the results. The initial result was not very encouraging. So far as Moscone could tell, the mouse had been opened up, was perfectly healthy, except for the fact that it was dead. Depressing. Victor Caroon was eccentric, but he was no fool, Mark said. The Jaunt attendants were getting close now, and he supposed he would have to hurry up, or he would likely be finishing this in the wake-up room in Whitehead City. Hitching a ride back home that night, and he had to walk most of the way, so the story goes, he realized that he had maybe solved a third of the energy crisis at one single stroke. All the goods that had gone by train and truck and boat and plane before that day could be jaunted. He could write a letter to your friend in London or Rome or Senegal, and he could have it the very next day without an ounce of oil needing to be burned. We take it for granted, but it was a big thing to Caroon, believe me, and to everyone else as well. "But what happened to the mice, Daddy?" Rick asked. "That's what Caroon kept asking himself," Mark said, because he also realized that if people could use the Jaunt, that would solve almost all of the energy crisis, and that we might be able to conquer space. In his Popular Mechanics article, he said that even the stars could finally be ours, and the metaphor he used was crossing a shallow stream without getting your shoes wet. You just get a big rock and throw it in the stream, and then get another rock and stand on the first rock and throw that into the stream. Go back and forth and get a third rock and go back to the second rock, throw the third rock into the stream, and keep that up until you've made a path of stepping stones all the way across the stream, or in this case, the solar system, or maybe even the galaxy. "I don't get that at all," Patty said. "That's because you got turkey turds for brains," Ricky said smugly. "I do not, Daddy," Ricky said. "Children, don't," Meredith said gently. "Caroon pretty much foresaw what has happened," Mark said. "Drone rocket ships programmed to land first on the moon, then on Mars, then on Venus and the outer moons of Jupiter. Drones really only programmed to do one thing after they landed: set up a junk ground station for astronauts, Ricky said. Mark nodded. And now there are scientific outposts all over the solar system, and maybe someday, long after we're gone, there will even be another planet for us. There are Jaunt ships on their way to 4 different star systems with solar systems of their own, but it'll be a long, long time before they get there. I want to know what happened to the mice, Patty said impatiently. Well, eventually the government got into it, Mark said. Karun kept them out as long as he could, but finally they got wind of it and landed on both feet. Karun was nominal head of the Jaunt project until he died 10 years later, but he never really was in charge of it again. Geez, the poor guy, Rick said. But he got to be a hero, Patricia said. He's in all the history books just like President Lincoln and President Hart. I'm sure that's a great comfort to him, wherever he is, Mark thought, and then went on, carefully glossing over the rough parts. The government, which had been pushed to the wall by the escalating energy crisis, did indeed come in with both feet. They wanted the Jaunt on a paying basis as soon as possible, like yesterday. Faced with economic chaos and the increasingly probable picture of anarchy and mass starvation in the 1990s, only last-ditch pleading made them put off announcement of the Jaunt before an exhaustive, stereographic analysis of Jaunted articles could be completed. When the analysis were complete and showed no changes in the makeup of Jaunted artifacts, the existence of the Jaunt was announced with international hoopla. Showing intelligence for once, necessity is, after all, the mother of invention. The U.S. government put Young and Rubicam in charge of the PR. That was where the myth-making around Victor Karun, an elderly, rather peculiar man who showered perhaps twice a week and changed his clothes only when he thought of it, began. Young and Rubicam and the agencies which followed turned Karun into a combination of Thomas Edison, Eli Whitney, Pecos Bill, and Flash Gordon. The blackly funny part of all this, and Mark Oates did not pass this on to his family, was that Victor Karun might even then have been dead or insane. Art imitates life, they say, and Karun would have been familiar with the Robert Heinlein novel about the doubles who stand in for figures in the public eye. Victor Karun was a problem, a nagging problem that wouldn't go away. He was a loudmouth foot-dragger, a holdover from the ecological 60s, a time when there was still enough energy flowing around to allow foot-dragging as a luxury. These, on the other hand, were the nasty 80s, with cold clouds befouling the sky and a long section of California coastline expected to be uninhabitable for perhaps 60 years due to a nuclear excursion. Victor Karun remained a problem until about 1991, and then he became a rubber stamp, smiling, quiet, grandfatherly, a figure seen waving from podiums and news films. In 1993, 3 years after he was officially dead, he rode in the pace car at the Tournament of the Roses parade. Puzzling, and a little ominous. The results of the announcement of the Jaunt of working teleportation on October 9th, 1988, was a hammerstroke of worldwide excitement and economic upheaval. On the world money markets, the battered old American dollar suddenly skyrocketed through the roof. People who had been bought gold at $806 an ounce suddenly found that a pound of gold would bring something less than $1,200. In the year between the announcement of the Jaunt and the first working Jaunt stations in New York and LA, the stock market climbed a little over 1,000 points. The price of oil dropped nearly 70 cents a barrel, but by 1994, with Jaunt stations crisscrossing the U.S. at the pressure points of 70 major cities, OPEC had ceased to exist, and the price of oil began to tumble. By 1998, the stations in most of the free world cities and good routinely jaunted between Tokyo and Paris, Paris and London, London, New York, New York and Berlin. Oil had dropped to $14 a barrel. By 2006, when people at last began to use the Jaunt on a regular basis, the stock market had leveled off 5,000 points above its 1987 levels. Oil was selling for $6 a barrel, and the oil companies had begun to change their names. Texaco became Texaco Oil and Water, 2045, water prospecting became the big name and oil had become what it had been in 1906, a toy. What about the mice, Daddy? Patty asked impatiently. What happened to the mice? Mark decided it would be okay now, and he drew the attention of his children to the Jaunt attendants, who were passing gas out only 3 aisles from them. Rick only nodded, but Patty looked troubled as a lady with a fashionably shaved and painted head took a whiff from the rubber mask and fell unconscious. Can't jaunt when you're awake, can you, Dad? Ricky said. Mark nodded and smiled reassuringly at Patricia. Caroon understood even before the government got into it, he said. How did the government get into it, Mark? Meredith asked. Mark smiled. Computer time. The database. That was the only thing that Caroon couldn't beg, borrow, or steal. The computer handled the actual particular transmission. Billions of pieces of information. It's still the computer, you know, that makes sure you don't come through with your head somewhere in the middle of your stomach. Meredith shuddered. Don't be frightened, he said. There's never been a screw-up like that, Mayor. Never. There's always a first time, she muttered. Ricky looked at Mark. How did he know? He asked his son. How did Caroon know you had to be asleep, Rick? When he put the mice in backwards, Rick said slowly, they were all right, at least as long as he didn't put them all in. They were only, well, messed up when he put them in head first, right? Right, Mark said. The Jaunt attendants were moving in now, wheeling their silent cart of oblivion. He wasn't going to have time to finish after all. Perhaps it was just as well. It didn't take many experiments to clarify what was happening, of course. The Jaunt killed the entire trucking business, kids, but at least it took the pressure off the experimenters. Yes, foot dragging had become a luxury again, and the test had gone on for better than 20 years, although Caroon's first test with drugged mice had convinced him that unconscious animals were not subject to what was known forever after as the organic effect, or more simply, the Jaunt effect. He and Moscone had drugged several mice, put them through Portal 1, retrieved them at the other side, and had waited anxiously for their test subjects to reawaken or to die. They had reawakened, and after a brief recovery period, they had taken up their mouse lives of eating, fucking, playing, and shitting, with no ill effects whatsoever. Those mice became the first of several generations which were studied with great interest. They showed no long-term ill effects. They did not die sooner. Their pups were not born with 2 heads or green fur, and neither did these pups show any long-term effects. When did they start with people, Dad? Rick asked, although he had certainly read this in school. Tell that part. I want to know what happened to the mice, Patty said again. Although the Jaunt attendants had now reached the head of their aisle, they themselves were near the foot. Mark Oates paused a moment to reflect. His daughter, who knew less, had nevertheless listened to her heart and asked the right question. Therefore, it was his son's question he chose to answer. The first human jaunters had not been astronauts or test pilots. They were convict volunteers who had not even been screened with any particular interest in their psychological stability. In fact, it was the view of the scientists now in charge. Caroon was not one of them. He had become what is commonly called a titular head, and the freakier they were, the better. If a mental spaz could go through and come out all right, or at least no worse than he or she had been going in, then the process was probably safe for the executives, politicians, and fashion models of the world. Half a dozen of these volunteers were brought to Providence, Vermont, a site which had become every bit as famous as Kitty Hawk, North Carolina had once been, gassed and fed through the portals exactly 2 miles apart, one by one. Mark told his children this because, of course, all 6 of the volunteers came back just fine and feeling perky, thank you. He did not tell them about the purported 7th volunteer. This figure, who might have been real, or myth, or most probably a combination of the 2, even had a name. Rudy Foggia. Foggia was supposed to have been and a convicted murderer, sentenced to death in the state of Florida by the murderers of 4 old people at a Sarasota bridge party. According to the Alcrifia, the combined forces of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI had come to Foggia with a unique, one-time, take-it-or-leave-it, absolutely not to be reported offer. Take the Jaunt wide awake. Come through okay, and we put your pardon signed by Governor Thurgood in your hand. Out you walk, free to follow the one true cross, or off to a few more cold folks playing bridge in their yellow pants and their white shoes. Come through dead or insane. Tough titty, as the kitty was reported to have said. What do you say? Foggia, who understood that Florida was the one state that really meant business about the death penalty, and whose lawyer had told him that he was in all probability the next to ride Old Sparky, said okay. Enough scientists to fill a jury box with 4 or 5 left over as alternates were present on the great day in the summer of 2007. But if the Foggia story was true, and Mark Oates believed it probably was, he doubted if it had been any of the scientists who had talked. More likely it had been one of the guards who had flown with Foggia from Rayford to Montpelier, and then escorted him from Montpelier to Providence in an armored truck. If I come through this alive, Foggia is reported to have said, I want a chicken dinner before I blow this joint. He then stepped through Portal 1 and reappeared at Portal 2 immediately. He came through alive. But Rudy Foggia was in no condition to eat his chicken dinner. In the space it took to jaunt across the 2 miles, pegged at 0.0000000000067 of a second by computer. Foggia's hair had turned snow white. His face had not changed in any physical way. It was not lined or jowly or wasted, but it gave the impression of great, almost incredible age. Foggia shuffled out of the portal, his eyes bulging blankly, his mouth twitching, his hands splayed out in front of him. Presently, he began to drool. The scientists who had gathered around drew away from him, and no, Mark really doubted if any of them had talked. If they knew about the rats after all, and the guinea pigs and the hamsters, any animal, in fact, with more brains than your average flatworm. They must have felt a bit like those German scientists who tried to impregnate Jewish women with the sperm of German shepherds. What happened? One of the scientists shouted. Is reputed to have shouted. It was the only question Foggia had a chance to answer. It's eternity in there, he said, and dropped dead of what was diagnosed as a massive heart attack. The scientists 4 gathered there were left with his corpse, which was neatly taken care of by the CIA and the FBI, and then a strange and awful dying declaration. It's eternity in there. Daddy, I want to know what happened to the mice, Patty repeated. The only real reason she had her chance to ask again was because the man in the expensive suit and the eternal shine shoes had developed into something of a problem for the Jaunt attendants. He didn't really want to take the gas and was disguising it with a lot of bluff, bully bull talk. The attendants were doing their job as well as they could, smiling, cajoling, persuading, but it had slowed them down. Mark sighed. He had opened the subject only as a way of distracting his children from the pre-Jaunt festivities. It was true, but he had opened it, and now he supposed he would have to close it as truthfully as he could without alarming them or upsetting them. He would not tell them, for instance, about C.K. Summers's book, The Politics of the Jaunt, which contained one section called The Jaunt Under the Rose, a compendium of the more believable rumors about the Jaunt. The story of Rudy Foggia, he was of bridge club murders and the uneaten chicken dinner, was in there. There were also case histories of some other 30 or more, or less, or who knows, volunteers, scapegoats, or madmen who had jaunted wide awake over the last 300 years. Most of them arrived at the other end dead. The rest were hopelessly insane. In some cases, the act of re-emerging case, which had occurred a mere 30 years ago. A Jaunt researcher named Lester Mickelson had tied up his wife with their daughter's plexiglass ropes and pushed her screaming through the Jaunt portal at Silver City, Nevada. But before doing it, Mickelson had pushed the nil button on his Jaunt board, erasing each and every one of the hundreds of thousands of possible portals through which Mrs. Mickelson might have emerged. Anywhere from neighboring Reno to the experimental Jaunt station in Isle, one of the Jovian moons. So there was Mrs. Mickelson jaunting forever somewhere out there in the ozone. Mickelson's lawyer, after Mickelson had been held sane and able to stand trial for what he had done, with the narrow limits of the law, perhaps he was sane, but in any practical sense, Lester Mickelson was just as mad as a hatter, had offered a novel defense. His client could not be tried for murder because no one could prove conclusively that Mrs. Mickelson was dead. This had raised the terrible specter of the woman, discorporeal but somehow still sentient, screaming in limbo forever. Mickelson was convicted and executed. In addition, Summers suggested the Jaunt had been used by various tin pot dictators to get rid of political dissidents and political adversaries. Some thought that the Mafia had their own illegal Jaunt stations tied into the central Jaunt computer through the CIA connections. It was suggested that the Mafia used the Jaunt's nil capability to get rid of bodies which, unlike that of the fortunate Mrs. Mickelson, were already dead. Seen in that light, the Jaunt became the ultimate Jimmy Hoffa machine, ever so much better than the local gravel pit or quarry. All of this had led to Summers' conclusions and theories about the Jaunt. That, of course, led back to Patty's persistent question about the mice. Well, Mark said slowly, as his wife signaled with her eyes for him to be careful. Even now, no one really knows, Patty, but all the experiments with animals, including the mice, seem to have led to the conclusion that while the Jaunt is almost instantaneous physically, it takes a long, long time mentally. I don't get it, Patty said glumly. I knew I wouldn't. But Ricky was looking at his father thoughtfully. They went on thinking, he said, the test animals. And so would we, if we didn't get knocked out. Yes, Mark said, that's what we believe now. Something was drawn in Ricky's eyes. Fright, excitement. It isn't just teleportation, is it, Dad? It's some kind of time warp. It's eternity in there, Mark thought. In a way, he said, but that's a comic book phrase. It sounds good, but doesn't really mean anything, Rick. It seems to revolve around the idea of consciousness and the fact that consciousness doesn't particulate. It remains whole and constant. It also retains some screwy sense of time, but we don't know how pure consciousness would measure time, or even if that concept has any meaning to pure mind. We can't even conceive what pure mind might be. Mark fell silent, troubled by his son's eyes, which were suddenly so sharp and curious. He understands, but he doesn't understand, Mark thought. Your mind can be your best friend. It can keep you amused even when there's nothing to read, nothing to do. But it can turn on you when it's left with no input for too long. It can turn on you, which means it turns on itself, savages itself, perhaps consumes itself in an unthinkable act of auto-cannibalism. How long in there, in terms of years? 0.00000000000067 seconds for the body to jaunt. But how long for the unparticulated consciousness? "Daddy, I'm scared," Patty said in a thin voice. "Will it hurt?" "No, honey, of course it won't hurt," Mark said, and his voice was calm enough, but his heart was beating a little fast. It always did, although this would be something like his 25th jaunt. "I'll go first, and you'll see how easy it is." The jaunt attendant looked at him questioningly. Mark nodded and made a smile. The mask descended. Mark took it in his own hands and breathed deep of the dark. The first thing he became aware of was the hard, black Martian sky as seen through the top of the drone, which surrounded Whitehead City. It was night here, and the stars sprawled with a fiery brilliance underdreamed of on Earth. The second thing he became aware of was some sort of disturbance in the recovery room. Mutters, then shouts, then a shrill scream. "Oh dear God, that's Meredith," he thought, and struggled up from his jaunt couch, fighting the waves of dizziness. There was another scream, and he saw jaunt attendants running toward their couches, their bright red jumpers flying around their knees. Meredith staggered toward him, pointing. She screamed again and then collapsed on the floor, sending an unoccupied jaunt couch rolling slowly down the aisle with one weakly clutching hand. But Mark had already followed the direction of her pointing finger. He had seen. He hadn't been fright in Ricky's eyes. It had been excitement. He should have known because he knew Ricky. Ricky, who had fallen out of his highest couch of the tree in the backyard in Schenectady when he was only 7, who had broken his arm, and he was lucky that it had been all he had broken. Ricky, who had dared to go faster and further on his slide board than any kid in the neighborhood. Ricky was first to take any dare. Ricky and fear were not well acquainted. Until now. Beside Ricky, his sister still mercifully slept. The thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on its jaunt couch. A 12-year-old boy with a snow-white fall of hair and eyes which were incredibly ancient, the corneas gone a sickly yellow. Here was a creature older than time masquerading as a boy, and it bounced and writhed with a kind of horrid, obscene glee. And at its choked, lunatic cackles, the jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Some of them fled, although they had been trained to cope with just an unthinkable eventuality. The old young legs twitched and quivered. Claw hands beat and twisted and danced on the air. Abruptly they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at its face. "Longer than you think, Dad," it cackled. "Longer than you think. Held my breath when they gave me the gas. Wanted to see. I saw. Longer than you think." Cackling and screeching, the thing on the jaunt couch suddenly clawed its own eyes out. Blood gouted. The recovery room was an aviary of screaming voices now. "Longer than you think, Dad. I saw. Long jaunt. Longer than you think." It said other things before the jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it away, rolling its couch swiftly away as it screamed and clawed at the eyes that had seen the unseeable forever and ever. And it said other things, and then it began to scream. But Mark Oates didn't hear it because by then he was screaming.